Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Danny Kahneman. Danny received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 for his groundbreaking work in applying psychological insights to economic theory, particularly in the areas of human judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. Everyone loved his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which came out 10 years ago and summarized decades of prior work on human judgment. Danny's new book, Noise, co-authored with Cass Sunstein and Olivia Siboney, is a must-read for everyone, from high school students to government and business leaders. It describes and measures the sources of undesirable variability in human decision-making behavior in all major areas of human activity. That includes justice, health, hiring, performance evaluation, immigration, child custody, insurance, investing, pretty much anything you can think about. I reviewed Noise in the LA Review of Books recently, and I've linked that in the show notes. Do check it out. Unlike previous episodes, this is the first one that's in person, as in the old-fashioned way. We're sitting in a studio in New York City, close to where we both live, and we will have a good old-fashioned lunch after this conversation. Danny, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
My pleasure.
Danny, noise is a very widely used term in many areas. So let's start by defining what you mean by it.
The word noise needs defining in this context because it is used in so many ways. So what we mean by noise in this book is undesirable variability in judgments are the same thing. And that can be variability between different people making a judgment or within the same person. And it's important that it's undesirable because sometimes we want diversity and sometimes and we don't call that diversity noise. So the concept really comes from measurement because we have that idea that judgment is measurement, where the instrument of measurement is the human mind. But you assign a value to an object, and the human mind does the measuring. And when you think about measurement, when you're measuring, say, a line with a very fine ruler, and you measure it multiple times, which is the equivalent of many people judging the same object, you will find, first of all, that you are not going to get the same result every time. If the ruler is fine enough, there is going to be variability. That variability is noise. And in addition, there is bias. And the bias is simply the average error. So if on average your errors are positive, you have positive bias. If negative, you have a negative bias. And those concepts of bias and noise apply as well to judgments and to decision-making in principle when you have different people offering their individual solutions to the same decision problem. So you have bias, which is a systematic error, and you have noise, which is the variability. What's important is that in measurement, there is a theory of accuracy, a theory of error. And in the theory of error, which is 200 years old and is accepted really in all the sciences, in the theory of error, bias and noise have equivalent positions. That is, they are equally important. Now, why all this very long background? Well, it is because when in talking about judgment, both formally and informally, in the literature and in common conversation, bias is everywhere. We speak, when we mention the word error, we think of bias. And yet, in the theory, noise is equally important. So the purpose of the book, it's a very long answer to a very short question, but the purpose of the book is to redress the balance, is to draw people's attention to the fact that there is another source of error, which is just as important as bias, in many cases more important, and is basically not visible. People are not paying much attention to it.
So why is that? I mean, clearly, I think you say this in the book as well, that bias has gotten most of the attention. There's a lot of emerging literature on algorithmic bias, especially in machine learning. I mean, this has become a big groundswell. So why is it that we've ignored noise for so long? And I think you do imply that it is often the bigger culprit in decision making. So why the situation?
Well, I think this has something to do with the way the mind works. And I think it's a characteristic of the human mind that we think about single objects or single stories. We think singular. We do not think about ensembles. We do not think statistically. Statistical thinking doesn't come naturally. Now, when you have a single person making a single error, you can attribute that error, that person is biased. And that feels like a causal explanation. And we also look for causal explanations rather than for statistical explanations. But you cannot never say of a single error, you can never really say, this is noise. It takes several errors in order to see noise. So noise is a statistical concept. Bias is a causal concept. And it's because of our preference for stories and for causal stories over statistical accounts that bias is so much popular than noise.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm going to come back to this notion of causality and correlation a little bit later, because one of the things you often hear is, correlation is not the same as causation, but I think one of the things you point out is that causation does imply correlation. But I'm going to save that for a little bit later. So let's come back to noise and just sort of dissect it. I think you did a wonderful job of using the good old Pythagorean theorem to illustrate this. And I think you said that these are independent sources of error, namely bias and noise. And so they're sort of quote unquote orthogonal in some sense. So let's put bias aside for now, and let's focus on the subject du jour, which is noise.
A major example, and in some way the most shocking example of noise, is noise in sentencing. That is, when you present judges and real judges with similar cases, with the same case, and you ask them to set a sentence, there is a shocking degree of variability. And what you find, for example, just to give you a sense of how much variability, is that if you take a crime for which the average sentence is 7 years in prison, the difference between two randomly selected judges is going to be 4 years. So that's the average difference if you pick two judges at random. And 50% of the time, the difference between two judges will be bigger than 4 years. This is really shocking. So that's noise. And it comes, you can dissect it into three components.
So before we go there, by the way, is that something that surprised you, the magnitude of it? Because qualitatively, we sort of accept that people are different, so we should expect that variability. But I was struck by the numbers. Were you surprised by that at all?
That is exactly that's the reason the book exists, really.
Yeah.
Which is that I did a measurement of noise in an insurance company, and I was struck by the size of it, and it was 5 times as large. The amount of variability we saw was 5 times as large as the executives of the company expected. And they didn't know they had a noise problem, but they had a very big noise problem. So this is, right, as you point out, I mean, wherever there is judgment, there's going to be variability. In fact, that's a definition of judgment. When we say it's a matter of judgment, we imply that there is room for reasonable disagreement. But now we're talking about a lot of noise. So why that variability among judges? So there is one source of variability that is easy to understand. So some judges are just more severe than others. Mm-hmm. On average, they set longer sentences, and we know something about those judges. They tend to be more in the South than in the North. They tend to be Republicans more than Democrats, and so on. I mean, but the main thing is there are large differences in the average. Then there is another source of variability that we're familiar with, and this is variability within judge. It turns out that when you present the same case Well, I mean, that's difficult to do with judges, but we know that from other professions, for example, radiologists, that you can easily present the same case on two different occasions. You're not going to get the same response. It's going to be there is within judge, within person noise. And we know about judges, for example, that they're affected by completely irrelevant aspects of the situation, like, well, how hot it is outside. Sentences are more severe when in hot weather. There's at least one study demonstrating that the result of the judge's favorite football game on the Sunday will affect the sentences they mete out on the Monday. So that's the irrelevant within subject noise. But the main source of noise is actually neither of those. I mean, both of those exist, and they're substantial, and they're very interesting. But the main source of noise is that people look at the world and they see the world differently. And they see every case different from the way others see it. And that would mean that if you took the judges and you gave them, say, 15 different crimes, and you asked them to rank the crimes from the most severe to the least severe, they would not agree on their ranking. It's not only that one of them would set higher sentences than the other. The ranking would be different. And that is, it turns out, the biggest source of noise, and it's the most mysterious, and it's a little like differences in personality. We know that people are different from each other, but we're not quite prepared to recognize the extent to which people see the same situation differently from one another.
And you refer to that noise as?
And that we call pattern noise.
Right.
And in fact, the within subject noise is also pattern noise, but it's transitory. Pattern noise is stable. Right. So it could be a stable characteristic of a judge, that one judge is more severe with cases of fraud relatively, and another is more sensitive to violence, and one has a special attitude to crimes against all people. And right. All those differences will cause differences among judges, and it turns out that that is very likely the biggest source of difference in general.
Right. You use the term stable pattern noise and occasion noise, which is when the decision was made. Like, was it hot? Was it cold? Was it in the morning, the afternoon, or the mood of the judge, or whatever? Okay, great. So we've kind of teased this apart. So what are the reasons for this? Sort of reminds me of one of my favorite Clint Eastwood quotes from Dirty Harry, where he says, man's got to know his limitations. But so humans tend to sort of overestimate themselves. They tend to overestimate the quality of their decisions, the consistency of the decisions. What are the bases for this? Because this is something you spend a lot of time discussing, is just the sort of psychological bases for all of these things.
The main thing we have to see that we go through the world basically with one interpretation of situations at a time. We are sometimes in doubt, but doubt is not a normal state. Our normal state is that we understand the world, or we feel we understand it. And we suppress alternatives to our judgment. And each of us believes, I certainly believe it, I suppose you do too, that I see the world as I do because that's the way it is. And if I see the world as it is, then I expect you to see it just as I do because that's the way it is. So that is a major reason why we ignore noise, because it's very difficult for me to imagine we're looking at that situation, it's obviously an A, and the idea that you would see it as a B seems bizarre because it is an A.
Right. And you also refer to the fact that we tend to make sense of the world in retrospect. And in retrospect, everything seems quite clear. I mean, it sort of almost reminds me of Duncan Watts's book about, everything is obvious, once you know the truth. And so that seems to be also one of the reasons why I think we think we understand the world in ways.
And the reason, I think, what you're referring to is the fact that in the normal interaction, in the normal experience of life, most events are not surprising. We're rarely surprised. And yet it's not that we expect specifically what happens. So you do not know what word will start my next sentence, but very likely it won't surprise you. It was the word but. And, you didn't know, but it made sense in retrospect. And that seems to be the way we live. We live by making sense of what happens as it happens. And we have causal interpretations. And after the fact, it's sort of obvious that it had to happen because there's an inevitability in hindsight to what did happen. And that gives us the sense that we are in touch with reality, that we understand the world. And that is, to a significant degree, an illusion.
And so if I were to sort of paraphrase, at the risk of oversimplifying, the issue is that we humans like stories, we like causal stories, we like to sort of see the connections between things. And we interpret a situation by pulling out an appropriate causal story that fits the situation and sort of call it a day. Is that a fair?
I don't know if that's the truth, but that's how I see it.
Yeah. So one of the streams of literature that you refer to is one that points to sort of simple models of things or people being better than human decision-making. And this is sort of something I've also kind of grown up with. But there's obviously no theorem that says that these models should be better than humans. But one of the things I sort of thought about, and tell me if I'm thinking about this correctly, is I think you're providing reasons for why simple models of humans tend to do better than the humans themselves. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I mean, there is a long literature. This is about 70 years of psychological research on it, where since the first book, a very important book, actually in my life history, it was one of the very influential source, by Paul Meehl on clinical versus statistical actuarial prediction, I think he called it. And the idea was that in multiple studies, he collected studies in which people, individuals, professionals, had made predictions about cases. For example, whether they would violate parole, whether a marriage would end in divorce, and whether how successful somebody would be in school. And then those were individual predictions based on some information. Now, when you put some of this information, you collect it, you put it in numbers, and you feed it into a formula, it turns out that the formula at least half of the time beats the human, and the other half of the time it's a tie. So there is no question that even simple formulas beat humans in predictions. And this has gotten a lot worse in the last decade, the inferiority of people, because we now have machine learning models which do better than those simple rules, and of course they do better than humans. So that's a well-established principle. And the main reason for the inferiority of human judges is that they are noisy. A simple rule and an algorithm, they have the property that when you present the same problem twice, you get the same answer. People do not have that property. People are noisy.
So one of the things that you refer to is this notion of objective ignorance. And I was really struck by that because, I sort of view the world also in terms of problems are either inherently predictable or they're not. Just the nature of the problems. In physics, the problems are highly predictable and financial markets are close to random. So, and that's sort of driven a lot of my thinking is that, whenever I encounter a problem, the first question I ask myself is, where does this lie on this predictability spectrum? And this is something, you refer to as objective ignorance. Can you sort of just amplify this for us? And
when people make predictions and then you compare the outcomes to their predictions, so you can define an error of prediction just at the difference between the prediction and the outcome. And we call that an error of prediction. But an error of prediction is not necessarily a mistake, because many events that we try to predict or forecast are simply not completely predictable. In some cases, like the stock market, they're essentially unpredictable. And so I use the term objective ignorance for exactly the dimension that you're describing as predictability. that there is a limit, it's an objective limit to what we can accomplish, and we'd better be aware of it, because we tend to blame people for having failed to forecast events. We blame them in hindsight, because in hindsight we understand the events. But in fact, because of objective ignorance, they could not have predicted the event.
So what do we do about all of this? So now that we understand the problem, we could, I guess, go in one of several ways. We could say, I think we should just sort of give up on humans and abdicate control of decision-making to machines because they're not noisy and these models do better than humans. And so we could go that way. The other path would be, let's try and improve human decision-making. And you spend a lot of time in the book talking about the latter. That is, how can we actually mitigate some of these errors that arise from noise? So you walk us through this.
Well, first, I would say that in many situations, when you can substitute a better instrument for human judgment, I think you should. And this is sometimes really raises difficult moral questions. For example, it's well established now that there are artificial intelligence programs, machine learning programs, that would do a better job than bail judges do in deciding whether individuals should stay in prison while awaiting trial or be granted bail. It's demonstrated beyond the shadow of a doubt that there are those programs, and you could replace bail judges by these programs. There is also a rule which is very difficult to accept, but it's very general, that whenever you have a rule, it could be an artificial intelligence program or a very simple rule, you have a rule and you have a human making judgments. If you let the human have the last word, there will be more mistakes than if you let the machine have the last word. So you should let the human have the last words only in cases that lie completely out of the distribution. Now, so I want to make it clear that our position would be, in principle, people should accept that machines do better than they are. But there are many domains where we're not close to doing that, where there just isn't enough information to feed to the machine. There isn't enough codable information. The database isn't there yet. And in many situations, and I leave aside the moral issues that people prefer their own judgments to be made by people than by machines. But there are many situations where it will take a long time before machines are seriously competitive with human judgment. In the meantime, what we have to do is to improve judgment. And in the book, as you say, we spend a lot of time on, possible ways to improve judgment.
So before we get to that part, and I do want to sort of get into your, for lack of a better word, your sort of normative framework or suggestive as to what people should do to reduce noise, including the noise audit. But before we go there, I just want to touch on something you said, namely that if you let the human have the last word, you're going to introduce more error. Now, these days in the popular media and also in research, I find that there's sort of this implicit assumption that humans plus machines will do better than just the machine. And I'm somewhat skeptical about it, only because all of my experience points to the contrary. And in fact, even on those few occasions where the machine was wrong, let's say it happens, 1 out of 1,000 times, the human is so used to the machine always being right that chances are they'll just sort of go along with it. So, but this suggests that human judgment should really be reserved for very special cases. And I tend to think of that as being sort of the edge cases, right? Where the machine is sort of clearly out of its depth and out of its capability. And that's where humans should take over. But that's just like a really hard problem, right? To define where this border should be, as opposed to treating every case like an edge case, which is what the current situation is, right? Because if a human deals with every case, a physician deals with every case, they're overloaded. Judges are overloaded, physicians are overloaded. And this is a major problem, both in healthcare and the criminal justice system. The challenge seems to be a better separation of responsibility between humans and machines. Often, humans just need to stay out of the way. How do you think about this?
Garry Kasparov, after he was defeated by Deep Blue for a number of years, advocated a human-machine combination as the ultimate winner of chess. Well, it turns out machines don't need humans. In fact, if you rid chess-playing programs of any human influence, that improves them. That is, any intervention of programmers or chess masters in designing chess-playing software actually makes it worse. A machine that just learns chess completely by itself will outdo people. And this is very general, this superiority, I think. And ultimately, you can see why. If a diagnostic program comes close to being as good as a diagnostic physician, it will not take very long for the program to do much better than the physician. And this is simply because programs can accumulate learning. Different programs in the offices of different physicians, they all learn together. And a single physician learning will never be able to match this. So we really have to accept the fact that the machine-human combination is unstable. Mm-hmm. And what we have, and this is very important in that whole debate, machines make fewer mistakes than humans, but they make different mistakes, which to humans appear stupid. And this is true, I think it's already true for self-driving cars. I think self-driving cars are already safer than humans. Mm-hmm. But any crash that involves a self-driving car looks like a stupid blindness. No human driver would have done this. And this is generally...
And the consequences could have been so much worse.
Yeah.
We just got lucky.
Yeah. Right. So this is remarkable that whenever, and that's true for diagnostic and so on, machines make different mistakes that humans would not make. And so when you see a mistake by a machine, you say, this is a stupid machine. It lacks any common sense. Of course, we don't have the opportunity to think what the machine thinks of our mistakes. Mm-hmm. But in fact, we make more mistakes than machines do. And this is something that it's going to take a very long time before people are ready to accept it. And it's a battle. We mentioned that in the book, but we did not insist on it too much because this is not something that you can convince people of.
So let's probe this issue of the resistance towards machine-based decision-making a little further and whether it has to do with the need for an explicit explanation that can be analyzed or appealed in the case of criminal justice. So let's take medicine versus, let's say, bail decisions. In healthcare, we're seeing increasing amounts of data about us available through sensors, including wearable devices, images, and I could envision myself trusting the machine's decision even without an explicit explanation. Whereas in criminal justice, I want to know why the decision is not in my favor. In other words, it seems to me that we'll more readily accept the healthcare decision without an explicit explanation, whereas this seems like it's a much greater barrier to overcome in parole decisions where we need a crisply defined rule and we want to see, quote unquote, the boundary that separates the decisions. How do you see it?
Well, I think that even in medicine, a machine that is unable to explain itself is not going to be very popular. And there is a lot of work currently in AI. I think this is one of the major areas of concern, is for machines to be able to explain themselves so that humans will understand their reasoning. In very, very complex problems, it's not going to be possible because the machine's reasoning is so much more complex than humans. But we would want a machine to simplify its reasoning so that it can talk to humans like children in a language that humans can understand. This is coming, I think. This is really coming in many domains. And It's not immediate, but it's in the next few decades. The speed at which this is developing is such that in the next few decades, we're going to see a lot of it.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's consider the problems of hiring and performance evaluation, two areas we all experience and where huge amounts of time and resources are spent. Performance evaluation causes a lot of stress and seems to be riddled with level noise, pattern noise, and occasion noise. Same for hiring, where first impressions count for a lot. What should we be doing differently in these areas?
Here you really have two problems. You have a lot of between people noise, which is pattern noise, or in some cases what we call level noise, that some people are more severe than others. So different interviewers or different personnel officers are going to make different decisions. So there is that pervasive consequence of noise, which is that customers or clients face lotteries. And they face a lottery because the individuals that they will be dealing with as a representative of the organization, the person who will hire or will determine a premium or will determine a sentence or will approve a loan, that person could make different decisions from her colleague. And so if she happens to be sick that day, you're going to get a different outcome. So those are the lotteries. And the hiring lottery is terrible. And it's terrible both because there are differences between individuals in the judgment they make, and there's a fair amount of occasion noise of random variability, like what is the first impression. In general, I think the conclusion about interviews is that when in the standard interview, which is formless, which is unstructured, the first impression is formed, maybe in 2, 3, 4 minutes, and the rest of the time is spent confirming that impression, which is basically a waste of time. So what you want is you want to make more efficient use of, say, an interview time, and we know how to do this. I mean, this is really well understood territory. It's not that interviews will ever be very accurate as predictors of performance, because there is a lot of objective uncertainty in the performance of people that you hire. But although they will never do well, a structured interview is much more efficient than an unstructured one. A structured interview, and this is, I think, quite a general noise reduction advice, is to break up the problem. So think of attributes that are important to a particular job, and then organize the interview so that you discuss each of these attributes sequentially with a set of questions, and you rate each attribute independently of the others. And there's that word independence is also very important. And that you delay your intuitions and your judgment until you have all the information. Delaying intuition is a major principle that we offer as a rule for noise reduction. So that's what we'd have to say about hiring. Also, in order to overcome individual differences, have multiple individuals look at each candidate. And I heard this week that there is a medical school where apparently under the influence of noise, they're going to have each candidate interviewed by multiple interviewers, each completely ignorant of the others, and each discussing a separate case different from the other interviewers, so that you have multitude of completely independent judgments. That's the way to go.
Interesting. And actually, you also refer to Google and how they hire, right? And
they have multiple judges. They keep them independent of each other. Mm-hmm. They do it right, basically. I mean, that's, I would say we don't have much to suggest to Google as from what we know of their process. This is as much as can be done, or close.
So if I were to try and come up with a formal process or protocol that you're proposing for noise reduction, the hiring problem seems like a good metaphor for a solution, which you describe as, quote unquote, options are like candidates. Can you flesh this out for us a little further?
The solution is a solution to decision problems where a choice has to be made. And there is a simple slogan: options are like candidates. That is, if you think of a decision problem and you have options, then you can break up the options into attributes. What are the attributes that should influence your decision? Try to evaluate each of these attributes independently of the other, delay your intuition, and form a global judgment only when you have a complete profile of all the attributes. So I really think that the hiring metaphor can be applied very broadly to decision making, and that it's a useful way to think about it. Certainly is a noise-reducing way of thinking about it.
Now, there's obviously impediments to all of this, right? So all of this comes sometimes at quite a cost, and sometimes at actually very low cost. There's certain things you say, which is like obvious kind of low-hanging fruit. Break the problem down into its components, make sure those are evaluated independently by multiple people, that you delay judgment to avoid sort of the ordering of information bias and all those things. I regard them as low-hanging fruit, like everyone should do them. What are the more costly things involved in these noise reduction methods, including the audit that you point out, which on the face of it sounds like, yeah, everyone should do this, right? This is a no-brainer. People should be aware of the noise in their decision-making process. But what are the practical impediments to doing this? What's easy, what's hard?
The book deals with what we call system noise. We really think of noise within organizations. So you have an organization or a system that is making decisions or making judgments. You have the medical system, you have the judicial system, you have the underwriting system, and then there are people who represent that system. And these people are noisy, and the problem of noise reduction is really a problem of organizational engineering. That is, how do you engineer the processes and the procedures of the organization so as to reduce noise as much as possible? And I would question your premise about the low-hanging fruit. I think that there's going to be a lot of opposition even to implementing what you consider obvious, because people like to use their intuition. They feel good when they use their intuition. And so the idea of delaying their intuition is going to be resisted. People don't like they don't like to have their thinking structured too much, at least initially. I think that people can get used to it, and an organization that wants to improve its judgments can do it, but not without resistance. Even the low-hanging fruit is going to be quite difficult. So, and almost everything that we've recommended, you could say, is low-hanging fruit. We have another recommendation about how to think about options and about candidates. And our recommendation is to think in relative and comparative terms rather than in absolute terms. People can be taught to do it. And if they're taught well and supervised properly, I think they can do it. But all of this, there is a risk that when you structure people's activities too much, you will take something away from their sense of independence, from the pleasure they find in their work. There is a risk of demoralization that really has to be considered very seriously when an organization wants to implement noise reduction procedures. And the first step, which you mentioned, for an organization, before it does anything else, it should measure how much noise there is in its decisions. And that is easy to do. We call that noise audits. It's just present the same problem to many people in the same situation and see the variability.
Exactly. You don't even need to know the outcomes.
Absolutely. Right? Because unless bias, this is one of the interesting differences between noise and bias, is that when you talk about bias, you have to know the truth in order to find a systematic error. Right. Noise, you just have the variability. You don't have to know the truth. You can use fictitious problems. Measuring noise is much easier than measuring bias. And there is no excuse, I think, for organizations not measuring the noise in their operations.
So let's go from organizations where you've got specific suggestions and guidelines, such as the noise audit. So let's go from that to individuals, because one of the things I said earlier was that this book is for everyone. It's really for individuals, and because decision-making sort of pervades, pretty much every aspect of our lives. And so I'm going to ask you a question, which is, what's your advice for individuals here to become better at decision-making?
Well, we have advice that we offer organizations about how to train the individual members who make judgments on its behalf. And collectively, we call those decision hygiene. Those are steps that, if taken, will tend to reduce noise and bias and improve the quality of judgment. And then when we move to individuals, or to unique decisions, we have a very simple line of reasoning. Whatever is good to improve the thinking of individuals in repeated judgments also applies to single judgments, and whatever is true would improve the judgments of organizations will also improve the judgments of individuals. So to the extent that principles of decision hygiene are applicable to the decision that people make, they should help people make better decisions. It is really that simple. The evidence will come from studying groups, but the lessons, the procedures, the decision hygiene suggestions are going to be applicable to individuals as to organizations.
So let's, at the risk of sort of getting too much into the weeds, let's talk about what this decision hygiene actually looks like. Like what are the things that go into, good hygiene?
Well, in the first place, the first move, as I said, is know how much noise there is, and then try to figure out what doctrine, how would you want your professionals to make their decisions? Plan it. And this idea of designing the process, for example, the process of underwriting, there are professions, and there are many cases where this exists, where actually the activities of a professional are designed and are planned. But there are many situations in which this is not the case. And to the extent that there is freedom for individuals within the organization to set up their own practices, that is where noise comes from. So trying to train people to apply similar rules and similar processes. Then there is, I think, an ongoing measurement of noise. And in many organizations, you have case discussions so that occasionally they will look at a case and a group will discuss it. To reduce noise, you would want every such meeting to begin with each individual making their own judgment of the case and exposing the variability that exists. At the moment, case conferences are designed in a way that hides the amount of noise and that gives an impression of consensus instead of an impression of noise. So there are really practical ways for organizations to proceed in terms of training, in terms of supervision, and caring not to impose too much bureaucracy and not to arouse too much resistance.
So when it comes to individuals, and usually I ask my guests, what advice they have for young people who are thinking about what they're going to do, how they're going to train themselves. And I can't help but feel, and this is sort of bolstered just by reading your book, that I think people should learn probability theory and Bayesian thinking and just sort of notions of base rates and how often does something occur. Because one of the things you point out, there's a lot of detail in the book, but one of the things you point out is how people often mistake similarity for probability. And that's kind of one of the things that sort of gets us into trouble. And this sort of is getting into Phil Tetlock's work on super forecasters. There seems to be some sort of hygiene involved there as well, right? That there's certain kinds of people who know how to think about a problem better than others. And by how to think, I mean they take into account things like base rates. They try and question whether their assumptions are accurate and things like that.
Well, Phil Tetlock is a friend, and his work is exemplary in this regard because he has studied super forecasters. Those are people who fairly consistently can make probabilistic predictions in, the strategic domain or political domain, and they make those predictions better than professional analysts. And it turns out that super forecasters are not born and not made, but they're both born and made. I mean, there are particular talents that they need, and they need an attitude of real open-mindedness, active open-mindedness. That is the attitude of searching for information that would disconfirm their present belief instead of searching for confirming information. And to some extent, super forecasting, improved forecasting, can be taught. That is, there are rules, and there are principles, and if you train people in the use of these principles, they're going to have less bias and less noise.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that struck me, is that we can actually train people to be more aware of these sources of noise and how to reduce them.
You were suggesting, I thought that you were implying that a course in decision-making in high schools would be a good idea. And I think it would be. I think it would be, it's intellectually interesting. There is depth to that topic. It's not superficial. And you can teach it at multiple levels. And there are some principles that people are really completely ignorant of, but that they could internalize.
That's a great suggestion for high school students to introduce a course on decision-making, especially in this day and age. I've been thinking more narrowly on probability theory and Bayesian thinking as tools, but the broader area of decision-making would be so much more interesting and motivating for high school students, and it would bring the math and techniques to life. It would make them aware of the properties of human judgment and decision-making earlier in life. I think that would be really useful. So, Danny, I want to wrap up with your thoughts about where we're heading in terms of the future division of decision-making between humans and machines, and what there'll be left for humans to do in a less noisy world. It appears that many decisions, including important ones, will be made by machines, and maybe we'll end up with the Arthur C. Clarke utopia, as he jokingly put it, of nearly full unemployment, so we can all play. How do you see this division of responsibility playing out between humans and AI in the future?
There is a Hebrew proverb that is useful in this context, and I think it says that prophecy is for fools. So anybody who claims to know where artificial intelligence is going is, I think, a deluded fool. It's moving so quickly and in such unexpected directions. I mean, the problem that was thought hard turned out to be easy. Problem that looked easy turned out to be hard. Who knows? All we know is there is progress. It seems to be people who are in it seem to think it is exponential. And the rate of progress is astonishing. I mean, I'm following this as an outsider, but I'm very interested in AI. And things that, a year and a half ago looked impossible are now routine. And that's the rate at which things are happening. So now, when we say most decisions, I don't know what exactly we have in mind, but it's going to replace, clearly, a lot of white-collar activity is going to be replaced. And this is true for legal work. I mean, obviously, looking for precedents or looking for relevant law is going to be simpler for an AI than it is for the best legal minds. It is going to be true for diagnosis. It's already true, for dermatology. I mean, you probably can do better to diagnose a dermatological illness with your iPhone than by going to a doctor. So those things are are happening. So it's going to be quite interesting, I think. I mean, I won't live to see it, but I would be curious, which is when it comes to functions of leadership. For example, the CEOs of large organizations, they've been there because of their experience, because of their flair, because of their good judgment. But basically, it's stuff that they have learned from experience. They have an internal database. If the day comes when the database is sufficient so that an AI can evaluate business propositions better than most CEOs can, that is something that I find very difficult to think about, because people in authority are going to be challenged. And when this, I think, last happened with decision analysis. Decision analysis, was proposed as something that would be a tool, but that would help decision makers. In fact, it never caught on because it was threatening to decision makers. And there's going to be a lot of resistance to AI, and from in a lot of ways. It's going to be social dislocation. A lot of things are going to happen. There are going to be interactions, because much of this will happen in China first, and who knows?
Yeah, who knows is right. I mean, it reminds me of, something I heard Herb Simon say that, well, he made several predictions. Some of them were a little optimistic, but correct in the longer term. But I think he said something like AI would sort of replace middle management, that at the end of the day, you'd have the people on the shop floor and CEOs, and it would sort of just hollow out middle management. It would be interesting for him to see how things have actually played out, because I think, AI could actually replace the shop floor as well, and what you're talking about, and top management as well. So it's just, maybe
it's unclear.
Maybe his prediction was not as bold as it could have been.
And where the humans are going to be something that humans are not going to want to cede to machines, and this is their values. I mean, what underlies your preferences? And conceding that to machines would be a very, very big step. And clearly, this is a place where there's a need for interaction. Some people in AI are thinking very seriously about it, about how you build in when you get highly intelligent AI and highly capable AI. How do you build in human values or adherence to human values so that they do not develop their own values, as in some science fiction?
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is sort of, I guess, taking us towards, I used to say what used to be science fiction, but doesn't seem that science fiction-esque anymore. The sort of, Elon Musk's, I guess, prediction that humans will actually change, that maybe we'll become part cyber. Mm-hmm. And if we don't, then maybe we'll end up as pets. That's a less than appealing proposition. Well, Danny, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for sharing your knowledge and thoughts, with the rest of the world. I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about noise and issues around human decision making.
My pleasure.